So a big welcome to you all and to our event this evening, Modern Day Slavery, Hidden in Plain Sight. And this is brought to us this evening by Amy Harris of the global non-profit organisation Hope for Justice, which aims to end human trafficking and modern day slavery. I'm Jane Andre, a member of the local Stamford and Rutland Amnesty group who are hosting this event tonight. And thank you so much for taking time out to join us this evening. You being here tonight shows support for our local Amnesty group, for Hope for Justice, and very importantly for human rights. Tonight's event is part of the Amnesty International Central England Festival of Social Justice, and this has involved some 50+ free events taking place between the 16th of April and the 31st of May. The Festival of Social Justice has brought together the 40 local Amnesty groups in the region and a range of amazing organisations like Hope for Justice to help spread the word about social justice and human rights and to encourage people to take action. So to start with, there are a few bits of housekeeping that I just want to run through quickly with you to make sure that we all get the most from the webinar. And then after this, I'll introduce you to Amy, our guest from Hope for Justice. And after her presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions submitted by you to be answered by Amy. So I'll start off with the housekeeping. If anyone at any point finds that their connection is lost or has any technical difficulties, please try closing the webinar and just rejoining through the same link, and we hope that will solve any issues. You will hopefully have seen the ground rules immediately before you joined the webinar, and these are available on your screen under the question chat heading, which you'll find in the rectangular control panel that should be in the top right of your screen. I'm just going to run through some of the key elements of the ground rules now. Just so that you're aware, this GoToWebinar platform provides a bit more of a broadcast style event, and as such, as an attendee, you're neither visible nor audible to us or to other people attending. We'd ask you not to use the hand up function as it's not operating for this event. And please note that the chat function doesn't operate as it may on some other platforms. There isn't actually a general chat facility between attendees or us for sharing comments. However, we would love you to submit questions for Amy this evening. So please, to do this, use the question option in your control panel. You may need to click on the white arrow in the orange box to expand your control panel, and then you can select the questions option from the drop-down menu. And to do this, click on the small arrowhead on the left-hand side. This opens up the question box. You can enter your question and then send. Just note that your question is only visible to our behind-the-scenes question organiser, Paul Webb, and myself, not to the other webinar attendees. And we would welcome you to submit your questions as we go through the webinar. We will do our best to respond to as many as possible during the time that we've got available for that. So as well as Paul working behind the scenes, I'm just going to mention our other invisible but essential background technical organiser, Harriet Wills. Our guest speaker, Amy, will be liaising with Harriet during her presentation to help bring you some of the visuals that you'll be seeing. Finally, we would like everyone to feel that they're in a safe and supportive space this evening. So we support freedom of expression that demonstrates respect to everyone. So in your questions, please be respectful of others. So thank you for listening to that, and without any more delay, I am delighted to start the event proper and introduce you to our guest presenter, Amy Harris from Hope for Justice. Thank you for joining us tonight, Amy, and a very big welcome to you. I'm going to allow Amy to introduce herself now, and I'll come back in again for the question time. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Jane. So thank you, Jane, very much for that introduction. As Jane mentioned, I am Amy. I am the Fundraising and Relationship Officer at Hope for Justice. I'm relatively new to the organisation. I actually only started Hope for Justice in January, but before that I was working in the museum sector. I was working at the Science and Industry Museum, and I was also doing a study course in museum management. And it was during that time that I visited an exhibition about slavery. And while I was at that exhibition, at the end of it, it had this really small section on modern day slavery. And before that point, like most people, I had an idea that modern slavery existed, but I'd never been confronted with it, and I'd never really looked into it too much. But I left that exhibition, I went home and I looked into it a little bit more, and it sort of became something that was niggling at the back of my mind. Then from there, a couple of months later, my current role at Hope for Justice actually came up, and I applied and I got it, which was great. But in the short time that I've been at Hope for Justice, I have learned so much about the realities of modern slavery. It's so much bigger than I ever expected it to be, and so few people know about it, which is why I'm so thankful to Stamford and Rutland Amnesty International Group for inviting Hope for Justice to talk to you all today, and to talk to you a little bit about what I have learned so that I can share it with you. On that note, like I said, when I joined Hope for Justice, I didn't know much. So at the beginning of all of my talks, I like to ask a few questions just to see what you guys already know so I can gauge where we're at. So on that note, as Jane mentioned, I'm going to ask Harriet to put some poll questions up. All you have to do is answer the question with whatever you think is right. It's in no way a test, so please don't feel as if it is. But the first question I'd like to ask is, when do you think that slavery was abolished in the UK? Do you think that it was 1833, or do you think that it was in 1933? And bear in mind, I did history at university. I knew the answer to this when I was asked this when I joined Hope for Justice, and I thought it was a trick question, so I still managed to get it wrong. So again, please don't feel like you're being tricked. It's just a question. Just go with whatever you think is right. And we're going to give you a few more seconds, so about 10 seconds left to answer the question. And yeah, then we'll see how much you guys know and if you can get it right when I didn't. So yeah, so if we can see the answer to that question, and let's see what you guys have picked. So yeah, it's a roughly almost half and half, but the majority is right. Slavery was abolished in the UK in 1833. And if we think about that, that was almost 200 years ago now. So almost 200 years ago, we came together as a society and we decided that treating people as commodities for commercial gain was no longer acceptable. So when we think about the fact that right now there are more people trapped in slavery than at any other point in human history, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and it just should not be happening. And knowing that there are more people trapped in slavery now than at any other point in history, the next poll question that I'm going to ask you is, how many people do you think are estimated to be trapped in modern day slavery currently? Do you think that it is 25.3 million people, or do you think that it is 40.3 million people? So we're going to give you another 10 to 15 seconds just to vote on this. And again, this question tends to reveal who are our optimists and who are a little bit more cynical. But it is a really interesting question because a lot of people are never actually confronted with having to think about the full scale of modern slavery. Like I said before, a lot of people know it exists, but a lot of people don't know the actual scale that it exists on. So I'm really intrigued to see what you guys think. And yeah, so 70% of you have gone for 40.3 million. Unfortunately, you are right, it is the higher number. When I first heard that number, it was really hard for me to wrap my head around. I have never seen 40.3 million of anything in my entire life, let alone could I imagine 40.3 million people. But one day someone put it to me as that's more than the entire population of Canada. So when we think about the fact that more than an entire population of a country are currently trapped in exploitation, it's just so hard to even comprehend. And bringing the questions back to the UK just a little bit, so of the people who were identified as victims of slavery in 2019, what do you think the most common nationality was? Do you think that they were British? Do you think that they were Polish? Or do you think that they were Vietnamese? Again, we'll give you another 10 to 15 seconds to vote. It's in no way a test at all, so feel free to just go with your gut on this one. And yeah, we've got a range of different answers, and none of them are technically wrong. It's just one is more than the other. So I'm very intrigued to see what you guys think about this one. And again, this is one that most people tend to get wrong. Oh, that's really interesting. So a lot of people have gone for Vietnamese, but the majority of you have gone for British. And again, the answer is British. You are correct. The reason why I think it's really important that we highlight that is because when I have conversations with people, a lot of the time when they hear modern slavery, they think of it as a faraway problem. They don't think of it as happening to their neighbour. They don't think of it as happening in their town or in their country. They see it as something that happens elsewhere, so they can ignore it. But the fact of the matter is that slavery is happening everywhere, and it's happening on our front doorstep, which is why we really need to care about this, and we really need to step up and do something about it. And the final poll question that I'm going to ask you guys is, do you think that you need to cross some type of border in order to be trafficked? And when I say border, I don't necessarily mean international border. This can be a county line, it can be a town border, anything of that sort. So yes, you do think you have to have been crossed across a border to be trafficked, or no, you don't have to cross any borders at all. And again, we'll give you another 10 seconds just to vote on this one. We usually get a range of questions with this, answers with this. Again, people think it's a trick question, and I promise you it isn't. But I'm really interested to see. No, correct. So I think I gave it away a little bit with the last question, but you are all correct. You don't need to cross any borders at all to be considered a victim of trafficking. The way that we usually put it that's easiest to understand is if you imagine that you have a hotel with a really long corridor, and you have a room on this side of the corridor and a room on this side of the corridor. You can be moved from this room to the next, and across that really short distance of space, you can become a victim of trafficking. And again, I think it's so important that we highlight that, because when I'm speaking to people, people tend to think of this as something that happens to people who are being brought into countries. They see it as an immigration issue. But the fact of the matter is that trafficking is not an immigration issue. Modern slavery is not an immigration issue. It's a human issue. And that is why we all have to do our part to end it. And now that we have talked a little bit about the facts of modern slavery and you have a bit more of an understanding of the realities, I think it's really important that we look at what modern slavery actually looks like, because we can throw those words around, but unless we understand the realities of it, it means nothing. So at the moment, there are 5 different recognised types of modern slavery, and at Hope for Justice, we specialise in dealing with 4 of those. The most common type of slavery that we see, both in the UK and abroad, is forced labour. Forced labour affects 16.5 million people worldwide, estimated that we know of, and a lot of people tend to think of forced labour as individuals who are working in nail bars and car washes. And that isn't to say that it doesn't happen in nail bars and car washes, because it does. But the fact is that it happens in very legitimate businesses that a lot of people trust as well. For example, a few years ago, we saw a case of individuals who were working in a mattress factory, producing mattresses for a really well-known mattress company. And those mattresses were going on to be sold in John Lewis. And that was really shocking to me when I found out, because in the UK, John Lewis is a really well-trusted brand, as they should be, because they didn't know that modern slavery was happening in their supply chains. Because the reality of modern slavery is that it's so hidden, and traffickers are so smart at the way they use people and get them legitimate jobs, that the businesses can't really spot it. It's really, really hard for them to find, which makes it even harder for us to spot as well. And the reality of someone's life when they're trapped in forced labour is that they're often made to live in really cramped conditions in a house with multiple other people who are often also victims of forced labour. they're often denied proper access to food and proper access to medical care, and their wages are taken from them. Oftentimes they may receive some of the wage, but it's never much, and sometimes they receive none of their wage at all. And this happens in a few different ways. The trafficker will either tell them that they're indebted to them and that they owe the trafficker money for getting them a job and for getting them housing, or the trafficker will simply set up the job in the individual's name, set up a bank account in their name as well, and keep all of the wages that they're earning. The second type of modern slavery that we deal with at Hope for Justice is domestic servitude. So domestic servitude is basically what it sounds like on the tin. It's when an individual is forced into a home, they are forced to cook, they're forced to clean, they're forced to do the shopping sometimes, take care of children sometimes if there's children in the house as well. And while when I say that, sometimes I think people don't fully imagine the full scale of what domestic servitude is like. But to put it into perspective, a case that really impacted me when I joined Hope for Justice was Ofwami's case. He was an individual who was 13 years old and from Nigeria, and he had come to the UK because he had been promised a better education by two individuals that he trusted. When he arrived in the UK, he was not allowed to go to school like he had been promised. He was forced to do the cooking, the cleaning. He looked after their children, and everything that he did was controlled. The way he spoke was controlled, what he wore was controlled, what he ate was controlled. He was forced to sleep on a strip of foam in the hallway of the individuals that he was living with. And there's two things that really, really shocked me about that case. First was that one of the individuals who kept them as a modern slave was a doctor in the NHS. They were going to work every day and working with vulnerable individuals. They lived in a normal suburban part of London. Their neighbours had absolutely no clue that they had a domestic slave, and they were just getting away with it. And it was so blatant, it was in such plain sight, but no one ever knew. And the second thing that is shocking about that case is that Ofwami was trapped for 24 years. He was in that situation. For 24 years, he controlled nothing about his own life. What he ate, where he went, who he spoke to, and how he spoke was completely controlled by his traffickers, and he wasn't afforded the education that he was promised. Luckily, he managed to escape that situation, but the only reason he managed to escape that situation was because the individuals who had trafficked him had gone back to Nigeria for Christmas, and while they were in Nigeria, he had heard about Hope for Justice on the radio, and he had actually managed to get to a laptop in the house and email Hope for Justice. And it was from there that we worked with the Metropolitan Police, and we went to the house and we rescued Ofwami. But what really struck me was when the police were in the house and they were with people that he could trust, he still physically couldn't go into the living room. They tried to move into the living room to talk to him, but because it had been an area that was so forbidden to him for so many years, he couldn't bring himself to go in. He still feared that even though his traffickers were in another country, that they would somehow find out and that they would punish him for entering the living room. And that just shows the type of mental control that traffickers have over their victims, that it isn't always physical control that's necessary. It isn't physical shackles anymore with slavery. It's very much mental shackles. And then the next type of slavery that we deal with at Hope for Justice is sexual exploitation. So I'm sure all of you know that sexual exploitation is when an individual is forced to commit sex acts for money and that they have no control over it. They are forced to work day and night. They often see little to none of the money yet again, and they are often controlled in very much the same ways in terms of their food's being restricted, medical care is restricted, who they speak to and when is restricted. And sexual exploitation is something that actually impacts predominantly women. And 71% of all victims of modern day slavery are actually women, so it is unfortunately really common. And the final type of slavery that we deal with at Hope for Justice is actually forced marriage. Forced marriage should in no way be confused with arranged marriage. They're two very different things. But forced marriage is when one individual has no say in their situation, or they are a child, which means they cannot consent to the marriage. Unfortunately, again, 1 in 4 victims of slavery are actually children, so this is not uncommon for children to be victims. And as I'm saying all of this, I'm aware that it's a lot of information, so if at any point anyone has any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them after I've finished talking. But of all of the types of slavery that I've just mentioned, at Hope for Justice, we have dealt with every single one of them. And we have done that both in the UK and abroad, because we work in 32 locations around the world, from the UK to Norway to Cambodia, Ethiopia, the US. I could go on, but I'm not going to name all of the places that we work. But we work in each of these places to make sure that we can help to change lives and end slavery. And the way that we do this is by taking a 4-pronged approach. So we work to prevent exploitation before it can happen. We work to rescue victims. We work to help them to restore their lives, and we work to reform society so that one day we will be obsolete and slavery will no longer continue to exist. And I do just want to share with you the details of a case that I think really exemplifies the approach that we take at Hope for Justice and that shows exactly why it works. The case that I'm going to share with you is called Operation Fort. So some of you may have heard about it. It was in the news back in 2019, and it was in the news because it's the story of the UK's largest trafficking gang being brought to justice. And Hope for Justice were instrumental in identifying the gang and the investigation that led to them being put behind bars. To understand how we ended up being involved, you have to understand the work we do to reform society. So one of the major things we do to reform society is that we approach businesses and we train their staff to spot the signs of slavery. And we had done this with a soup kitchen in the West Midlands. And we trained the staff there because often soup kitchens may see victims of slavery because victims often don't have access to food properly or enough food, or they may end up homeless. But we had trained the staff at the soup kitchen, and one day they noticed 2 individuals who they had concerns about. They approached the individuals and they just sat down and had a conversation with them, and they identified themselves as victims of slavery. And from there, the staff members contacted Hope for Justice, and we worked with the West Midlands Police to move those survivors to slavery, move those survivors to safety, and to also work to investigate the traffickers who had put them in that situation in the first place. And what I really want to note there is that rescue is often thought of as this massive, like, dramatic moment, but the reality is that rescue can be as simple as sitting down and having a conversation with someone and asking them if they're okay and recognizing the signs to do that. And that conversation, that training, that knowledge of slavery existing led to us being able to uncover the UK's largest trafficking gang. The gang had 8 members. It is believed that they had upwards of 400 victims. 92 of those victims we were able to identify. 61 of them were directly identified by Hope for Justice, and 11 of those victims we actually supported all the way through identification all the way through to the court proceedings as well, and after and beyond that, to help them restore their lives. I do just want to share with you some images of the places that the victims of Operation Fort were living in, because I think until you see them, it's really, really hard to understand the magnitude of what their life was like. So Harriet, if you wouldn't mind placing the first image into the on the screen, please. Thank you. So I wish that I could say that this is a stock image that we found of a derelict house for shock value, but this is one of the places where the victims of Operation Fort were living. As you can see, it is very, very cramped. There were multiple people living in the house. There was no running water in the house as well. And mattresses had been pulled in off of the street for the victims to sleep on. And I'm sure the first thing that strikes you about that image, because it's the first thing that struck me, was the amount of mold on the walls. And the victims were getting sick quite consistently because of the conditions that they were living in, and yet they were still expected to go to work and do manual labour jobs, earning sometimes as little as 50p a day, and come home to this, and this is what they had to call home, and this is the reality of what their life was. Harriet, if you don't mind moving to the next image, please. As I mentioned, the house was so cramped that one individual actually had to sleep next to the toilet. And the image that you can see on your right, I've chosen to show you that because I personally think that when you understand it, it's a really powerful image. There is all of them, well, some of the money, some of the debit cards, and some of the IDs that the traffickers in Operation Fort had, all of them with the names of their victims on. And this image, to me, just exemplifies everything that you need to control an individual. Oftentimes, the way traffickers work is they will get someone a legitimate job and they will say that they need their ID to fill out paperwork for that job, but then they'll never give them their ID back. And what that does is twofold. So first of all, it provides the trafficker with the victim's home address, because oftentimes they are actually working to support a family that still live at that address. And when they express discontent, the trafficker will say, well, I know where your family lives, and if you don't do what I want you to do, I'll hurt them. Secondly, if we think about what you need in the modern world to be able to move freely and to be your own person, an ID is really essential to that. Similarly, with the debit cards and the money is essential to free movement in the modern world, and oftentimes traffickers will take out a debit card in their victim's name, they'll spend their wages through that debit card, and they'll also go into overdrafts and spend and rack up a bunch of debt that when the victim is out of exploitation, they still have to deal with. They'll still have bailiffs knocking at the door. So it's not as simple as leaving that situation because they don't know what's awaiting them. And even with that image, a lot of the time people ask me, so how do people end up in this situation and why would they stay? If they're going to work in normal factories where the other people around them aren't victims of slavery, why don't they turn to the person next to them and say, I need help? Or why don't they pick up a phone and call the police? But it is never as simple as that. And we actually produced a training video a couple of years ago that shows exactly how this can happen and what it's like for someone who is living in slavery. So Harriet, if you wouldn't mind just playing Yano's story for me, please. And it is a dramatisation, but it is based on an amalgamation of cases that we've seen at Hope for Justice. Again, if you have any questions while you're watching this, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Dobrý deň, volám vám kvôli ponuke práce, ktorú som videl v novinách.
Jasné, veľa ľudí mi teraz volá. Toto je ale dosť namáhavá, ťažká manuálna práca. Máš záujem?
Áno, mám. Keďže teraz nemám prácu, vaša ponuka znie zaujímavého.
Kedy môžem začať?
Môžem začať aj hneď.
OK, vieš čo, pošli mi nejaké údaje a skúsim ti vybaviť na budúci týždeň dopravu. Čo ty na to?
Áno, to znie dobre.
Nazdar, ty si Jano? Serus, čau, jaká bola cesta?
Celkom dobrá.
Hej, super. Vieš čo, budem potrebovať tvoj pás a telefón. Nebo nič, to je v pohode, len potrebujem dobyvať ešte nejaké potvrdenia a povolenie a potom ti to vrátim. Môžeme ísť. Tu budeš bývať.
Vravel si, že budeme mať vlastnú izbu. Keď sme spolu telefonovali, vravel si, že budeme mať vlastnú izbu. To nie je to, na čo sme sa dohodli.
Chcel si robotu?
Chcem!
Chcel. Máš robotu, vybavil som ti robotu, budeš robiť pre mňa. Ešte nie je vybavené pracovné povolenie. Nerob problémy. Príde polícia, zatknú ťa, pošlú ťa domov. Dobre ti vravím. Tak rozumel si? Tak rozumel si?
Rozumel!
Just to cheer up. Same blank expressions every day. Give it up trying. Yeah, watch this. Right, mate, cheer up. What's that about? See what I mean? It's not bad, this one, you know. Carry on then.
Which one do you want me to take?
What, you want me to tell you everything, like? That one.
Vieš čo, budem potrebovať tvoj pás a tvoj pás. Tu má jedlo, žerte.
Už toho mám dosť. Robím to ako otrok, ani poriadne jedz nedostanem.
Čo si povedal?
To je málo, nevládzem robiť.
Teraz sa počúvaj, ty kokot! Keď ti poviem, že budeš robiť! Takže takto, kamarát. Keď nechceš hrať, nežer. Vy všetci mi tu dlžíte peniaze. Takže budete makať, pokiaľ mi to nesplatíte. Nezabúdaj, že mám tvoj pás a viem, kde býva tvoja rodina. Takže pokiaľ nechceš, aby sa im niečo stalo, drž hubu.
Jano! Jano! Hey! You got a minute?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Thanks for coming in. Look, as your line manager, it's my responsibility to maintain your safety. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, but I just need to know, how did that happen?
Yeah, I was walking from home and I slipped on the road and I hit my face to bricks.
Oh yeah, okay. It's quite the shine you've got, isn't it? Funny enough, one of your mates was in here last week. Exact same thing. You certainly know how to keep me busy, don't you? Right, well that's pretty much everything I need. If you wouldn't mind just signing that.
Okay.
Oh, know it's my job to ask these questions and to get to the bottom of things, don't you?
Yes.
And if you ever need to talk at any time, you know where I am. Okay.
Apologies, I didn't unmute myself. But Yana's story to me is especially powerful because while it is a dramatisation, it is based on amalgamation of a bunch of different cases that we've worked on. It's based on fact. Traffickers exploit the desperate situations of individuals for financial gain, and they mentally and emotionally and physically manipulate them in order to keep them trapped in exploitation. One of the victims we worked with a few years ago told us how they had expressed dissatisfaction with the situation to the trafficker, and the trafficker had then had their friend, who dressed up as a British police officer, come to the house and beat them up. And this taught that individual that they shouldn't trust the UK police, that the UK police were in on it, because they had no clue that this was just someone's friend dressed up as a police officer. They thought that this was the reality in the UK, and they thought that they wouldn't be able to escape it even if they asked for help. Another of the victims, so someone who was actually a victim of Operation Fort, they recounted to us how when they expressed dissatisfaction and they wanted things to change, the trafficker told them that they would take them to the woods and force them to dig their own graves. And this is the sort of stuff that traffickers use to make the victims feel powerless, to make them feel like they have no other option but to stay. And while Operation Fort was a great success in that we rescued 92 victims, there were still an estimated 400 victims that we weren't able to find. There's still an estimated 136,000 individuals in the UK alone that we believe to be victims of slavery. And there's still 40.3 million people around the world who are being exploited for commercial gain right now. And that is a massive part of why we do what we do at Hope for Justice, because we want that to be zero. We want all of those numbers to be zero. And it's a massive part of why rescue is only one part of what we do. Restoration is a huge part of our means of ending slavery. So at Hope for Justice, we work to restore the lives of the survivors, and we do this through our IMSA model. So IMSA actually stands for Independent Modern Slavery Advocate. Again, if you have any questions about this, please feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. But our independent modern slavery advocates are teams of people who come from social work backgrounds, legal backgrounds as well, and they are there to provide survivor-centered care and help survivors to make choices and bring back the freedom to their life that they deserve. They help them to access housing, they help them to access counselling, drug and alcohol support, language skills as well. They help them to get access to money for food and benefits as well. And most importantly, our IMSAs help our survivors to go to court and fight for their justice and bring their traffickers to justice as well. Because that is a massive part of what we do. In order to end slavery, we have to fight it. And these victims, at the hands of their traffickers, have had their independence, their livelihoods, their dignity and their hope stripped away. But we truly, truly believe at Hope for Justice that with the right support, these survivors can not only survive, but they can thrive and go on to live happy, healthy and wonderful lives. For example, one of the clients that we worked with, named Powell, when we met him, he was at risk of homelessness. because while he was being exploited, traffickers had taken benefits out in his name fraudulently. And once he had left that situation of exploitation, he was being chased for that money. But after working with our IMSA teams and our advocacy teams, we were able to get that debt written off. And now Powell lives in a beautiful flat with his partner and their child, and he's working full time and he's living the life that he wanted to lead. He's supporting his family, he's got a beautiful family, and he's happy and healthy. And that is the impact of the work that we do at Hope for Justice. We want to make sure that individuals are taken out of that exploitation, but we don't just leave them to deal with everything that comes with that. We make sure that they can go on to have the best life possible. And you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great. That's what Hope for Justice does. But what can I do to make an impact, and how can I help to stop slavery? Well, there's a couple of really easy ways that I think that you can make an impact. And the biggest one that you can do is use your voice. Every single one of us has a voice, and every single one of us is likely to know someone who has absolutely no clue that slavery exists or has no clue of the extent of slavery. So after you get off this call, I want you to tell one person, whether that is a housemate, whether it's a family member, or even if it's the local cashier at your corner shop, tell them that slavery exists and that we need to do something about it. Because Operation 4 never would have happened had those soup kitchen workers not known that slavery existed and that they should get training to help spot the signs. So just using your voice can have such an incredible impact. Secondly, learn to spot the signs. I'm not saying that's easy, because it isn't, and if we could all spot the signs, then slavery wouldn't exist. But there are a few things that you can look out for. So for example, if you're ever walking past a business at night time and the business is closed but the lights are on inside, that could be an indicator that people are living inside the premises. If you are at a business and someone is afraid to talk to you, if they avoid eye contact, and if they seem fearful of any conversation, that could be a sign that they are a victim of modern day slavery. Also, if people are arriving at work at weird times in groups and they're picked up and they're dropped off, that could be another sign. And this isn't to say that if you see one of these signs that it definitely means that they're a victim of slavery, and it isn't to say if you see all of them then that it definitely means they are either. But what it does mean is that if you can learn to recognize some of the signs, you can raise the alarm. If you ever do have absolutely any concerns about someone or about a business that you think might have people working for them in exploitative conditions, then please do call Hope for Justice or email us, just contact us in some way. And if you are fearful for the immediate danger, the health of someone, then please do call the police. The worst that's going to happen is the police will investigate and they'll decide that nothing's happening and you were wrong. The best thing that's going to happen is that you have actually helped that person escape exploitation. And finally, if you're leaving this call and you feel empowered and you want to go away and you want to do something right now, we've just launched our annual Hope Challenge at Hope for Justice. So Hope Challenge, every year we challenge our supporters to come together to raise awareness and raise funds to help support the vital work that we do. This year it's called Hope Challenge 200. The whole idea is that we want to get as many people together as possible to spread awareness and raise £200 each, because we are a massive believer that 200 people coming together and making a small contribution, whatever way they can, is more powerful than one individual going to extraordinary lengths to make a change alone. Because at Hope for Justice, we really believe that if we come together to fight this, we can make an impact, we really can change lives, and we will end slavery. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking because I've been talking at you for 40 minutes, but I really hope that some of that has connected with you and that you feel empowered to do something about modern slavery. And now, Jane, if you would like to come back in, and if you have any questions or if anyone else has any questions, please do feel free to pop them in the chat and I'd love to answer them.
That's great, Amy. Thank you so much. That was very well. It was a real eye opener. Some of those figures is that really shocking. Thank you very much for all that information and opening our eyes to what appears to be happening around us with far more prevalence than I'm sure many of us were aware of. So thanks for that, Amy. And yeah, questions. We've got some questions coming through now. So thanks for that. And anybody else that's got some questions, pop those in the question box now. Now is your time. So let's have a look at some of those. Somebody's got a question. Yeah, what about 0 hours contract and slavery? Is that an issue?
So we don't class that as slavery. We actually go off of the UN's definition of slavery, and the 4 types of slavery that I mentioned before, so forced labour, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, and forced marriage are the ones that we deal with. The UN doesn't count 0 hours contracts as slavery, even though we do recognise that there are issues with those as well.
Okay. Thank you for that. There's a question here. You mentioned that 77% of companies expect to find modern slavery somewhere in their supply chain. Is that worldwide or in the UK?
So I believe that that figure is for the UK only. I'm not too sure on the worldwide figure, but consistently we've seen that it is roughly quite similar. And in the UK, we have laws in place that are meant to stop modern day slavery within companies. So if it's happening here, it's very likely that it's also happening elsewhere that have the same laws in places that don't have as many laws in place as well.
Wow, that's a huge figure, isn't it? 77%. So there's another related question to that then. When you say that companies expect to find trafficked people working for them, can they be asked or made to check more carefully?
Yeah, so the government brought in legislation a few years ago now, which means that any business that is earning over £36 million a year has to have a modern slavery statement in place. And that means, and part of that is doing those routine checks and actually investigating their supply chains in order to identify where slavery could be happening. That said, that legislation alone doesn't fully do what it's intended to do, because businesses, all they have to do is say that they have searched, that they do have a system in place, they post that on their website and they are then compliant. And it also doesn't address businesses that earn under £36 million a year, which is a massive section of business. So they are meant to have those systems in place, but it isn't necessarily always happening, and it isn't happening to the extent that it should be either.
Okay, thanks. So, right, so I suppose another related question to that then is, is our government doing enough to support, help, and to help end slavery?
I think it's really hard because, again, they introduce this legislation, and on paper, it should be enough. It should be enough for businesses to actually search and understand their own supply chains. However, the legislation that they brought in doesn't really help them to understand how they should be doing this. It just sort of says you should be doing this, which is an area that I do think that they could improve on, by actually helping businesses to do it, and also possibly making it a lower threshold, so every business has to do it and not just those earning 36 million plus. But they are trying, they are introducing new legislation, and yeah, I think we all could be doing more, including the government personally.
So do Hope for Justice, just linking in with that, do Hope for Justice put pressure on the government to improve?
So we work with the government, so every now and then we will have individuals who liaise with the government, talk about the ways that they can improve, and that's mainly around legislation. We have had a few sort of letter writing campaigns, and if there's something that comes up that affects victims of slavery, we will often put that out to our supporters and say this is what you can do to help. For example, there's recently been a law change in terms of Brexit and immigration rules that will affect victims of slavery, and we asked our supporters to fill in a survey about that goes to the government. So in that way, yes.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's pick out another one here from the list. Sorry, just having a look here. So presumably these people are valuable to the traffickers. So do they seek medical care, and are GPs trained to recognise the indicators?
Yes, so that's a really good question. We have seen it before where victims are denied medical care. For example, one of the victims of Operation Fort, they hurt their arm at work and they were denied medical care, which now means that they have permanent damage to that arm. So while they are valuable to the traffickers, traffickers are also aware that they don't want to put them in a space where they could be identified. And so GPs are to some extent trained, but they're trained in a lot of safeguarding issues, and it can often get a little bit lost. We do work with some GPs, so one of the volunteers that we have is a GP, and she's absolutely amazing. She's very much all for spreading awareness and telling everyone that she works with about all of the different signs. But a lot of the time it is on individual GPs and GP practices to actually approach us for training. And yeah, again, it's one of those spaces where more training is necessary and would definitely make a massive difference if everyone was trained to the fullest extent.
And do you actually approach GP surgeries yourselves too?
We have done before. So like I mentioned with the GP that we work with, so we have people who are called ambassadors. So they're members of our volunteer community groups. They're in a lot of different professions, and they are also hopefully just as speakers. So they will go out and they will speak to people, and they'll find their own speaking engagements, some of which are with GPs. And then when it's appropriate, we'll have our official training team come in and deliver actual training so that they can spot the signs properly. Okay,
lovely. Thanks, Amy. Right, let's pick another one out. Who regulates and monitors multinationals exploiting workers in developing countries?
Again, very good question. I'm going to be completely honest, I do not know the full extent of that. The majority of my knowledge is very UK based, but I'd be more than happy if whoever asked that question, we're going to be sending out an email afterwards that has my email attached. If you want to email me that question, then I'd be more than happy to ask around, because someone will definitely know and I will find out the answer for you. And yeah, we do go off of the UN's definition of slavery and we adhere to their practices, but I don't think that they're able to check to the extent that we would like.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Amy. Right, another question then. What can be done about those in domestic servitude who live in the homes of diplomats in the UK? I understand this is a real problem. Also, why doesn't international air travel do far more about unaccompanied children coming into the UK? I understand if UK children have to travel abroad on their own, documentation is required, but that doesn't seem to have to happen with children coming from, say, Africa. So the first part of that was about domestic servitude, children living in the homes of diplomats in the UK, Amy.
So with that, I think that that is a really complicated question, obviously, because of diplomatic immunity in that. But in terms of diplomats in the UK, I like to think that the majority of people wouldn't turn a blind eye if they knew to spot the signs. Traffickers are very, very smart in making it seem as if it's a consensual situation. A lot of the time when it's children involved, traffickers will say that they are supporting that child either by providing them with an education, and they'll say, oh, in return, they'll help me out around the house. So when people are coming over and they see the child, they'll think, oh, well, that makes sense to me. A lot of the time, traffickers, especially diplomats, will make sure that they aren't showing anything that they don't want to be seen. They're very good at hiding what isn't palatable. So in terms of what can be done, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we need more people to A, be aware of the signs, and B, be willing to be a whistleblower, be willing to maybe go against the status quo and go against what is the power structure, to turn around and say, this is not right, and I'm willing to report you to the relevant authorities. And that's really as far as I can go on that at the minute. But if, again, you want to email me, I'm more than happy to chat about that in more detail. And the second part of the question was to do with children coming into the UK via air, was that right?
Yeah, that's right. Coming over, they talk about UK children travelling abroad. They have to have documentation, but that doesn't seem to happen with children coming from, say, Africa.
So with that, it's very much dependent on the international law and the airlines. And one of the things that we do at Hope for Justice is we work with businesses, and one of our partners is actually Manchester Airport. So we have this thing called Slave Free Alliance, which is our partner business. They work with businesses to help them identify issues of slavery within their supply chains and how they can actually work to spot it and stop it. This is a conversation that I'm not sure if it's already happening. However, one of the people that I work with is so passionate about getting Hope for Justice stands into airports to stop things exactly like that. They want to have people there handing out just a very subtle informational flyer that gives information about what trafficking is, so that the individual can identify it themselves, because we see oftentimes that people don't realise that it's happening until it's already happened. And also so then they know who to call if they're able to. And it is definitely something that we need much more conversation about, because the thing that we notice is that businesses want to get involved and they do want to stop it, they just don't know how. And this is one of those areas that we'll work with them to identify, have you thought about this? Because a lot of the time they haven't. They just think, oh, it's less paperwork for us to have this child come in without a piece of paper saying that they're allowed to, or without a next of kin. So again, it's one of those things that we are working with businesses. It's just a very slow process, but we are getting there.
So that's interesting. So you say you work with Manchester Airport. So I mean, has Hope for Justice approached all of the airports, and Manchester's the only one that's chosen to do anything, or?
So the way Slave Free Alliance works is it's only been operating for about 3 years, so it's still relatively small. Hope for Justice has been operating for about what year are we in? 9 years, whereas Slave Free Alliance has only been going for 3. So in that time, they've just sort of been slowly but surely like building up the profile. And because we're based in Manchester, it was one of the first people that we approached, and they came back to us. But a lot of the time we are expecting businesses to also approach us, and it's just something that we haven't managed to reach out to everyone yet, because we're still a really small team and the capacity isn't quite there to reach out to everyone yet. We're just waiting for people to come in as well.
So there's lots more scope, which is good. You know, for a lot more work that can be done. Just need to get it done as quickly as possible. Yeah. Okay. So some more questions. We've got quite a few coming in, which is great. So how do you help overcome threats to harm the families of a slave, somebody that's been trafficked?
So the hope is, when we encounter an individual and we're with them, that the trafficker involved in that has been caught as well. That doesn't necessarily always happen, because the amount of movement that happens, sometimes we find survivors when they've already left exploitation and now homeless. The way we overcome it a lot of the time is it sounds awful, but having to move. It's simply making sure that the survivor is as safe as possible. Whenever we find a survivor, we make sure that they are moved from the city that they were trafficked in, so they're not in the same area anymore. And if it comes to the family of that survivor, we would recommend the same for them. It's not an ideal situation, but we do work to make sure that they have as much protection as we can afford them, and we'll work with different authorities in different countries to make sure that we can do that.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Another one, Amy. It's great there's so many questions coming in. You mentioned the obvious examples that we may think of, such as car washes and nail bars. Are these often cases of modern slavery that you are aware of? If so, what can we do about this?
So car washes and nail bars are a funny one, because we do see that modern slavery happens in these areas. However, it's nowhere near as prominent as people expect it to be. I think it's because a couple of years ago, papers sort of really hooked onto the idea of foreign workers coming to the UK, setting up these businesses, and these businesses being illegitimate. But the majority of nail bars that we've been into, and also car washes, has been less car washes, but the majority that we've been into, when we speak to the people there, when we actually investigate it further, it is completely legitimate. I think that oftentimes people think it isn't legitimate if people are like less likely to talk to them, or less likely to possibly speak English, or I don't really know what it is, but it isn't as common as people think. So it does happen, but at Hope for Justice, we've seen it a lot more in factories than we do anywhere else.
Interesting. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. Another one. Are there strong penalties for companies who do not sufficiently address modern slavery through the legislation you mentioned? Is there any kind of watchdog?
Yeah, so there are fines, and there is a watchdog in that basically the legislation essentially says that you have to have it on your website. So there is a commission that will check that it is on there, but all that they really do is check that it's on there. As I mentioned before, it can literally say, we can do better, but we're not doing better currently. And it just has to be signed by an exec, and that's all that's necessary. So companies are very rigid about actually having them on there, because they're really easy to actually put up and very easy to not really do much with. But there are fines involved. I think it depends on the size of the business, the amount of money that you get fined. But again, it's nowhere near as stringent as I think it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Needs to be a lot more, I think, on that, because statements are so easy to make, aren't they? Words, not deeds. So they need to have the deeds, not just
exactly,
the words.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, do you consider modern slavery families who bring relatives to look after children or old people?
Again, no, that's not what we include in the definition of slavery at Hope for Justice. We go off of the UN's definition of slavery, which includes the types that I spoke about earlier. And I think in those situations, it would entirely depend on if that could sort of edge over into domestic servitude, if the individual had no free say in that, if they didn't want to be there, but they were being forced to be there and they weren't being paid, then that would edge into modern slavery, and that is something that we would investigate.
Okay. Thank you. How are we doing for time? We've got probably time for a couple more. So, do people from abroad who are identified as being trafficked get refugee status in the UK? Interesting question.
No, so it isn't refugee status. There's a different system. So people from abroad who are recognised as victims in the UK, all individuals to be recognised as a victim of slavery have to go through something called the NRM, which is the National Referral Mechanism. And that is how the government identifies you as a victim of slavery, and then also how you reap, I want to say, how you get support for that status. They're given 46 days to figure that out. And they're given, 46 days to essentially figure out what their status is and what they want to do and how they want to proceed.
Yeah.
They aren't given refugee status, so they're not immediately entitled to stay in the UK. But one of the things that we do at Hope for Justice is we have legal teams. We don't specialise in immigration. That's not something that we do. But we have a list of trusted immigration lawyers who can help us and who we know aren't going to rip off the victims and who are actually working to help them. And we'll support them through that if they do want to stay in the UK. We'll make sure that they have the best possible chance of doing that.
Yeah, okay. Good, okay, thanks for that. And we've got here, obviously the main reason someone has come to the UK and tragically ended up in slavery is economic. Can you generally ease victims into acceptable employment and the beginning of a proper life here?
Yeah, we see it really often that individuals who have been exploited can very easily, well, I don't want to say very easily because it's a very long sort of journey to get there. You have to think about the amount of trauma that is associated with what they've been through. Oftentimes we see that traffickers, instead of paying them money, will pay them with drugs and alcohol, which means that they then have substance abuse issues that we have to deal with first. We have to deal with the trauma first. But at the end of it, a lot of the time that I've heard of and I see, they do actually end up in some form of meaningful employment and they end up essentially living the life that they wanted to.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, so there are happy endings, you know. It isn't all doom and gloom.
Okay, so we need to, we've got time for a couple more. Do you know how long modern slavery has been a problem and is it getting worse?
So modern slavery has been a problem since slavery was abolished, however you want to say it. It's just evolved and taken on new forms. In the current situation, within the pandemic, it's really hard to say whether it's gotten worse, but the pandemic has increased the number of vulnerable people. It's increased the number of individuals who are searching for a job and who are desperate for a job. And that means that it is easier for traffickers to take advantage of that. And then also in the age that we're in with the internet, there's a whole other side to things where we see, especially in the US, with children who are being groomed online and then are being enticed to meet people in person, and then they end up being victims of modern slavery. So in some ways it is getting worse because we have so many different evolutions to this now, and there's so many different facets that we have to deal with. It's not as clean cut as we would like it to be, and as the title of this talk suggests, it is very hidden and it is really hard to deal with. So unfortunately, slavery has always existed. Modern slavery has existed for quite a while, and yeah, things aren't getting any better anytime soon, unfortunately, but we're trying.
Yeah, so increasing people's awareness of it is so important, isn't it? Because otherwise people just have no idea, do they?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a good question here. What can I do to make sure that I'm buying from retailers with slave-free supply chains? Because that looks to be quite a problem. It was 77%, wasn't it? So yeah, companies. So
yeah, so it is. I'm not going to lie. It's really, really hard. Companies that you would expect to be able to trust, and it's not their fault necessarily. We've seen products in sort of like Asda and places like that. Obviously I mentioned John Lewis before, and it's these places that are trusted that don't purposely exploit workers, but it still happens anyway. I think the best thing that you can do to try and stop shop in a slave-free way would be to check out their website. do a little bit of due diligence just before you buy from them. See what the modern slavery statement is like. While they have to have it there, you can usually tell who's actually doing something and who isn't. If it sounds like a lot of vague wording and it's very long and it seems really hard to read, then they're probably not doing that much. If it seems very clear cut and you can say, yeah, they're clearly taking steps, they're clearly trying to have a slave-free supply chain, then I would probably go with them. But I wish I could say that it's easy, but it's really not. It's something that everyone struggles with.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point that is that you have to make an effort to find out, don't you, and scrutinise things. Make a personal effort. Okay, so we've got one last question, and then we need to wrap up. And I'm sorry if we haven't had a chance to answer everybody's. But as Amy said, her email address will be in the follow-up email that comes out. So if you haven't had your question answered, you can send her a message afterwards and get a personal answer. So is there what other practical action can be taken to help end slavery or that we can take? Is there anything else that you haven't mentioned?
So practical actions, I've mentioned using your voice, learning the signs. If you're interested, then please do check out the Hope for Justice website. We have local community groups called Abolition Groups that you can join. They're volunteer groups. They work to raise awareness in local communities. They work to help us when we're talking to the government and we want like a letter writing campaign, and they generally are there to help us do the work that we do. That's a really practical step that you can take. Otherwise, as I just mentioned, doing your due diligence and not just accepting that slavery is something that happens. I think oftentimes, especially recently, we've been talking about sustainability and we kind of accept like in some supply chains slavery is going to happen, but you don't have to accept it. You can choose to try and shop from slave-free supply chains as much as you can. You can choose to use your voice and you can choose to find out a bit more about Hope for Justice maybe, and get involved with us and take practical steps with us. So they're the things that I would suggest.
Okay, great. Yeah, good. We could write some letters to some of the airports, making them aware of you and suggesting that they get in contact and train their staff and have some kiosks up for giving out those leaflets, as you said. Yeah.
Oh, my colleague's gonna love you. Yeah. Get those kiosks in there.
Get to it, everybody. Okay, great. That's lovely. Well, we need to wrap up now. So again, we've had masses of questions. So thank you to everybody for that. It shows great engagement with this topic, and rightly so. As we said, if you haven't had your question answered, then ping Amy an email using the email address in the follow-up email that will come out to you tomorrow. So thank you very much, Amy, for joining us this evening. It's been very interesting, quite horrific really, to find out how much is actually going on. But you have helped to reveal what's going on, and definitely some practical things that we can do. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me, by the way.
Pardon?
So thank you very much for having me, by the way.
That's right, pleasure. So yeah, and thanks to our great behind the scenes support team, Harriet Wills and Paul Webb, for helping put this webinar together and present it tonight. So that's great. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been lovely to have you with us. Just to let you know that this event has been recorded and it will be uploaded onto our festival YouTube channel, and details of this will also be in the email that's coming out to you. So if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it so that you can spread the word about modern day slavery and what people can do, then please let them know and share it widely. That would be a good message, a good piece of practical action that we can all do. So I've mentioned the email that's coming out. This will have a link to Hope for Justice website, where you can also find out how to donate if you're able to support the work that they're doing. There's information reminding you of how to spot the signs of human trafficking, and also a bit of information about the Hope Challenge 200, that Amy mentioned to you, how to take part in that and raise some money. We mentioned Amy's email address as well. So just to let you know that this is the last scheduled webinar of our local Stamford and Rutland Groups Festival, but the last webinar of the entire Central England Festival is on Saturday the 29th of May at 7 o'clock, and that's hosted by the Worksworth and District Amnesty Group. It's going to be a great evening. It's on the topic of refugees and asylum seeking through the eyes of young people, and it's a Destinies theatre event exploring how the arts can contribute to healing and making a new home and a new life. So you can register for that via the Central England Amnesty's webpage, details of that coming out in the email as well. So that's well worth making the effort to see that, so don't miss it. So that's everything. Thank you once again for joining us this evening. And on behalf of us all, I wish you a very good night. Bye now.